morning. I thought I'd start my talk out today by sharing some statistics about sea level rise and how many millions of people are at risk along our coastlines. I was going to talk a little bit about vulnerability and how vulnerable many towns and communities are to future storms and storm surges. But there's not much I could say that would be any more shocking to most people here than what you, or many of you, may have lived through last October when Hurricane Sandy hit the Jersey Shore. Sandy was a true 100-year storm when it hit, and the devastation it brought leveled homes, submerged towns, entire communities. I know there are probably people here who either lost their home, or certainly there are people here who know somebody who did. And for many people, the storm was totally unexpected. But for me, 3 years into making a documentary about coastal storms, sea level rise, and coastal development, and a film that I thought was almost finished, the thing that was most surprising about Sandy was the timing. This film that I set out to make was intended to be really a glimpse into the future, a way of talking about sea level rise and climate change so that people could understand what impacts might be for our communities somewhere down the line. And when I saw this storm hit, I had a couple of waves of nausea. The first wave of nausea was because I had become connected to so many people in these communities, and so I was worried about just the people on that level. The second wave was realizing that this film that I'd been working on for so long, that I thought, again, was almost finished, suddenly was going to take an entirely new direction. And so my goal with making this film initially was really to tell a story that could bring people together, to be as truthful and honest and as objective as possible, so that instead of being a polemicist and pushing people into corners where they would argue, we could find solutions for these very pressing problems. And so I set out and interviewed over the course of 3 years and spoke with many different people gathering knowledge and information. I spoke with scientists and geomorphologists, engineers, coastal engineers, people on both sides of the political spectrum, liberal and conservative, surfers, ordinary residents, lots of different people. And somewhere around October of 2012, I thought I'd wrapped my head around many of these very complex issues in a complex picture, intellectually at least. But when the storm hit, emotionally, I realized how connected I'd become to a lot of people in these communities. And as a person, one of the first things I thought after the storm hit was, well, what do we do now? And again, as someone who'd become invested in many of these communities on a personal level, I was looking for answers to that question. And some of the first answers came in the form of something that has been broadcast over the airwaves ever since. I don't think you can be from New Jersey or really anywhere near and not have been exposed to this ad campaign, right? There's a lot of positive values here. The ideas of unity, perseverance, rebuilding, common goals and good. So on the surface level, it's really saying, again, we're stronger than the storm. The coast is open. Please come back. We need you. And somewhere beneath that, I think it's saying, we're going to rebuild these communities. We're not going to let them sort of, dissolve, I guess, into chaos. So, as a filmmaker, I see that, and I sort of think to myself, and I saw that, and I thought, well, okay, but something's missing. And that thing that was missing to me was the sense that something fundamental had changed. And so, we rush often to rebuild after these kinds of storms. And, the reason why I think we do is because most of the time the coast looks a little like this. It's a really beautiful, serene place, and it's hard to imagine the kind of damage that a storm like Sandy can bring. And as storms like Sandy or the storm of '62 or other storms sort of fade into the distance of our memory, we forget that some of these places, maybe like beaches and barrier islands and low-lying coast, aren't necessarily permanent features of the landscape. So here you can see these are the barrier islands off the coast of New Jersey. There's a string of basically this line that goes down off the east coast, and these islands are really no more than 5,000 years old. And when they were, over the course of their short geologic lifetime, they've migrated several miles westward. Just to put in perspective, when George Washington was a little boy chopping down his cherry tree, these islands would have been about a half mile west of where they are today. And they can move in the course of just, a weekend storm sometimes. They can certainly move in the course of a lifetime. And so in many ways, you can really think about them as having kind of a life of their own. This thin strip of sand, which is essentially what it is off the Atlantic coast, had its beginnings geologically 20,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And as sea levels rose quickly, it pushed sand and sediment up the continental shelf and then sea levels, they slowed about somewhere 8,000, 9,000 years ago, and as they slowed, they allowed all this sand and debris to kind of gather in place, and it became the things that we recognize today as Absecon Island or Atlantic City, as Seabright, Sandy Hook, all these kind of locations that we now know by their names. And Long Beach Island. Long Beach Island is where my documentary Short Up was set, or at least primarily. And Long Beach Island, it's very typical for a barrier island. It's about 18 miles long. It's about 1,500 feet wide on average, somewhere around 3 to 7 feet above sea level. It's also typical in the way that it has been developed, especially in the course of the last 40 or 50 years. Long Beach Island has 8,000 permanent residents and about well over 100,000 people in the summer, and that's a ratio that's pretty consistent up and down the coast. The point of this slide is to say that LBI is part of what's known as a high-hazard coastal shoreline county. In the United States, they make up less than 10% of the landmass. 39% of Americans live in these counties, and that number is up 39% since 1970. And so if the trend line continues, you can imagine pretty soon more than half of Americans will live in this very small amount of land that's literally disappearing. So 20,000 years, the coastline of New Jersey was roughly 90 miles east of where it is today. This is the continental shelf, that sort of dark area that you see off the light blue area. 20,000 years seems like a really long time. But if you and sea levels rise and fall at different rates over time, right? But if you just take a crude average of 20,000 years divided by 90, you end up with 222. So 1 mile every 222 years. And just for a little more historical perspective, had Christopher Columbus kind of hit New Jersey when he was landing in the New World, he probably would have run aground about 2 miles east of where he eventually did. Globally, in the 20th century, sea levels have risen about 8 inches, some places more, some places less. Ben Horton is going to talk later today about sea level rise and all of these kind of variables that go into regional sea level rise. The point really is that as the planet warms, ice melts, oceans expand thermally, sea levels rise, and land is submerged. And while 8 inches may not seem like a whole heck of a lot, the consensus now among the scientific community is that we can expect somewhere in the range of 3 feet of sea level rise around the planet by 2100. So what does this mean for coastal communities and barrier island communities? To me, it means they're on the front line of climate change. And I don't think anybody wants to be on the front line of anything, honestly, right? But there's something primal about these places, the coastline, the edge, being on the edge. And that's what brings us there. We just want to be there. We just want to be there. And I totally understand that. And I want to be there myself often, every weekend in the summer. But it's one thing to visit a place, and it's another to live there, right? And once you understand the vulnerabilities of many of these places, these islands, these coastal lands, the way that we've developed them becomes a little bit bewildering. Prior to World War II, most of these coastal communities were populated mostly with seasonal hunting cabins or other kinds of basically shacks. They're certainly not shacks anymore. This was something that really struck me, I found fascinating. We ran into this project right here as we were making the film, and this is what it looks like to build a house on a barrier island. Essentially what you do is you take a hose and you loosen up sand, and then you drive a piling in, and then you put your house on top. And that way, when a storm surge comes, you have these breakaway walls, and you probably recognize some of these pictures. A lot of these walls broke away after Sandy, and the water just flows underneath your house. But you can elevate a house like that, and you probably should if you're living in these places and if you can afford it, but it's expensive. And it doesn't answer the question of what are we going to do about these islands. It's very difficult to raise an island, and it's hard to raise a bridge access point. It's hard to raise infrastructure, hard to raise entire communities. But what are these places going to look like in 30 to 50 years with more erosion and sea level rise? We talk about this idea of learning from history so we don't repeat the same mistakes again, but we do quickly lose track of these cycles of storms and sea level rise, and we try to engineer a lot of these places to fit the style of development that we've grown accustomed to, rather than trying to work with the natural processes in these places. And so for well over 100 years, we've been using things called groins and jetties and seawalls, hard structures, to try and slow and stop different movements along the coast to try and keep these property lines in place. Orrin Pilkey, scientist at Duke University, referred to this as the New Jersification of the coast. And what he's referring to, essentially, is the idea that once you use a groin or a jetty to try to hold sand in place in front of your property or your home or wherever it might be, your neighbor's going to experience a lot of the same problems that you were experiencing, and then you build another and another and another, and so on until you find that the entire coastline is covered in these types of groins. This is the view down from the seawall in Seabright, and this is another consequence of, over time, of hardening. In this case, it's that there's no longer a beach. And so recently, the Army Corps of Engineers has been doing this thing called beach replenishment. Many of you may have seen beach replenishment in action, but the idea is that basically you dredge up sand and you pile it on the shoreline, and you create a wide beach and a dune to protect private property and infrastructure from storm damage. Over time, storms come, waves come, rearranges the sand, moves it back out to sea, and you come and you have to put more sand in place. And so, what we find is that it's a lot like the myth of Sisyphus, really. This man who had to push a rock up to the top of a mountain, and then every time it would roll back down again, and he had to do this on infinity. But this isn't, Sisyphus. It's not a myth. It's reality. And for a lot of people, what's going on these islands, they feel like this beach replenishment has helped them survive Hurricane Sandy and other storms like that. And in many cases, it's true. But it can't help with bulkheaded back bays, which you can't replenish, and it can't help in many other situations. And so the problem is, once you start with beach replenishment as your solution, like Sisyphus, you can never stop. And so who pays for it? Federal government historically has paid about 65%, with the rest shared between the states and the local communities. And after Hurricane Sandy, the government's been paying 100%. But into the future, no one really expects that the government's going to pay for all of these projects. And so if you've come to rely on them, what do? This isn't a problem that's going to go away. This is something that we're going to experience all over the planet. Many communities are going to have to deal with this, and the people who are going to be least able to kind of deal with the consequences are those who can least afford to rebuild or relocate. And so the question is, what do we do for these people? How do we help? What are some of the solutions that we can use to address them? And the number one thing is we have to deal with fossil fuels, and we have to transition away from fossil fuels. But there's enough heat in the system now to guarantee a certain reshaping of our coastline in the future. So we need to do all kinds of things, like have permanent funds for people who wish to relocate, to move away from the coast, so that they can get out, and then their homes and their home can become part of a natural buffer zone to help as sea levels rise and storms come in. And we have to help communities that are burdened with the loss of tax revenue, property tax revenue, which is what they rely on when people move out. So we need tax reform. We really have to re-envision what it means to live by the coast. And this is another thing we can do. It's called a living shoreline. Russell Burke from Christopher Newport University designed these down in Virginia. They're oyster reefs, and they also helped kind of build resiliency along the coast. This is something that could be easily moved to a place like New Jersey. This is another vision of the future. This is probably also no one's idea of a seasonal hunting shack, but this is the architect Stephen Yablon, and this is a project he developed for a competition at PS1. It just helps us think about what it means to build and develop in these places. So here we are back again to the present day where we're rebuilding. And I totally, obviously, in many ways understand the urge to do that. But what are we going to be looking at 30 to 50 years from now? There's this word retreat. That's the word that's typically used to describe what it means to move away from the coast. And in the context of the Stronger Than the Storm campaign, obviously the word retreat doesn't ring very nicely. It sounds like you're kind of putting your tail between your legs and running away. But what does it mean to be stronger than a storm, really? I mean, it's not something you can hold down and make surrender. So do we really, I think the question is, do we really want to be kind of digging trenches and drawing lines in the sand here? Perhaps the next ad campaign could be something along the lines of smarter than the storm? Are we going to be smarter than the next storm? I mean, that's really the question. And, I think as we've been dealing with climate change for a while now, and in the rebuilding effort after Sandy, we have to really think about the fact that our work has only just begun. Thank you.